Go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Malia Fullerton, and I am Professor of Bioethics and Humanities here, and help to co-direct the BRI program with my colleague Karen Peterson at the Fred Hutch. This is, of course, lecture number 5 and kind of the culminating activity for this summer's BRI program. So thanks for being here. Congratulations. You made it, and now I'm trying to kind of get us moving. Oh, I know what I'm doing wrong. We need to get into the slide presentation. All right. Why is it not working? Huh. Is it going? Oh, right. Well, yay. So as everybody is aware, we've had a new process this summer, electronic sign-in and registration. Reminder that all of you who checked in as you came today, you're going to get an evaluation for the lecture. We really value your feedback. As soon as that evaluation is completed, you will get credit for this, and you are now nearing the end, and hopefully all of you have completed your discussion group work as well. It was a new process for this summer, and we asked for your patience at the beginning, and the good news is we are there. We made it through. So thank you very much. Thank you for your patience as we worked out the kinks. Hopefully you will be able to kind of get all of the information that you need to ensure that your training programs know that you did the great work to be involved in this program this summer. So thank you again for your patience. Just a reminder of our mantra, our creed this summer for BRI is that we create culture in our moment-by-moment interactions with one another. All of you in actively participating and attending these lectures and then coming to the subsequent discussion groups are in the process of creating that culture of research integrity for all of us. So we thank you again, and we hope you will be able to take some of the insights that you have gleaned from the material that we provided for you this summer forward into your training and into your subsequent professional careers. So thank you, and thank you for your feedback, particularly for this last lecture. So our 5th lecture today, our guest speaker, we have a speaker from right here at the University of Washington, is Dr. Carole Palmer. Carole is professor and associate dean for research in the UWI School, the Information School, where she conducts research on data curation and digital collections with the specific aim of advancing interdisciplinary inquiry, open data for the public, and professional data services. So she's here to address the responsible conduct of research overall topic of data acquisition, management, sharing, and ownership. And we are very fortunate to have her and her expertise with us here today to talk to us about data sharing across disciplines, evidential cultures, and curation for reuse. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Palmer.
Well, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here and to be invited, for this topic in this particular program. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity. Here's an outline of what I'm hoping to cover. We'll start with a little background and trends in the development of data infrastructure and sharing, particularly with this lens on interdisciplinary research. And then I'm going to share with you one of my favorite conceptual frameworks that I think is really instructive for thinking more deeply about what it means to share data across different fields, and that's the evidential cultures. And then we'll then dig into a case study of some research I've done that's more of an empirical analysis of geobiology. And as you might have gleaned, I don't have particular special expertise in biomedical arena. So I'm hoping that there's things here that will resonate with you, and I think we'll figure that out maybe in the question and answer session. And then we'll pull back and think a little more about the data ecosystem and the services at a more practical level, what you can be doing and how you can work with others to help you achieve goals in data sharing. So I like to start with thinking back to 2003, which was really a watershed year. There was an explosion of directives on cyber infrastructure and data sharing at the federal level. This was the year that the Final NIH Statement on sharing research data came out. After a lot of comment coming from the community, there were at least 11 other reports that I'm aware of. So I'm sure there's more, from the National Science Board, from the National Research Council, from NSF, on data sharing and cyber infrastructure. And so, interesting, my animation's not showing up here, but it's working. All right, so 2003, all of those are coming out, and then it just continued, this flood of directives at the federal level, but not just in the sciences. It was also coming through in the humanities, social sciences. Europe also became very active, and so our field in particular, we're really starting to take notice and really started to move into this arena to help move data sharing forward. And in those reports, there was a theme that was consistent throughout that we saw either implicitly, but often very explicitly, as in this particular report on long-lived data, that the grand challenges behind cyber infrastructure and building these environments for data sharing really were about how do we collaborate and make data usable across disciplines. The key question here was, how does NSF assure that data are accessible to a broad, diverse, interdisciplinary community? And the second really grand challenge that we won't have as much time to think about today is, well, what do we do about sustaining all these digital collections, these really highly volatile and actually quite vulnerable digital collections? This ever-increasing investment in creating these collections, how are we going to maintain them? It is going to take decades and decades of curation and investment. Then we got, making sure my animation's working, about a decade later, we finally got sort of confirmation coming from the White House. So we were all applauding. The Office of Science and Technology Policy put out a memo from the Obama administration. Subject, increasing access to the results of federally funded scientific research. Now, many of the agencies, actually most of the agencies, as you saw, already had expectations in place, policies, but they were hard to monitor, they were not really being enforced, and actually to this day, there's not explicit enforcement on many of them. But this was a great pivotal point, and the idea was that digital data from federally funded research should be made available, note also useful, for not just the scientific community, but also for industry and the public. And we'll come back to that public part later on because it's as complex as anything. So behind all this, of course, is the idea of accountability. You're getting all these federal funds, you're producing all this data. It should be available for people to reuse. But there also was this economic factor. There was a strong emphasis on enhancing economic growth for entrepreneurship, job creation, etc. But for us who are working in the information sciences and really invested in this, for us, we thought, well, finally, there'll be serious attention to the data management plans that were now being required when you put in your proposals to the federal agency. So we thought the floodgates would open. It's not exactly what happened, but there was a lot more happening on university campuses in particular to try to adhere to these expectations. So during this time, this sort of decade, my lab, or work back at Illinois when I was there, were doing empirical studies of data practices across many, many disciplines. We were working primarily in the sciences, a lot of work in earth science, but also social sciences, humanities, etc. And one of our observations very early and has continued to this day is that even those researchers who we feel were sort of champions of data sharing, we found were really most willing or inclined to share data that we considered to be actually rather low value for reuse. That was in terms of very, just even as raw materials for research. For instance, in crystallography, lots of enthusiasm around data sharing, but they were wanting to send it out in forms that were really only good for the publishers to put a figure in the publication. But they certainly weren't optimized for aggregation and integration with other data, and especially not for application to other fields outside of its original purpose. At the same time, we would hear over and over again, well, I don't need to worry about this. My data will never be of use to anyone else. So we might be in a soil scientist lab in one part of campus, and we would hear that. We go across campus to a hydrology research center and hear the same thing, but yet see how there might be opportunities for bringing data together that could be meaningful, especially around locations and certain phenomena. We also would hear over and over, and still hear, there are no standards in my field to help me, prepare data to make it shareable and easy to deposit. But we know that this isn't not the case. It wasn't the case then, and it's certainly not the case now. If you were to go to the fairsharing.org sort of hub for standards, which were, before that was actually the biosharing resource. It was all in the biosciences. It since has expanded and now is covering many other fields in addition. Now you'll find 1,300 standards for data alone. These are reporting guidelines, these are markup languages, they're metadata schema. So really an abundance, probably an overabundance, it is very complex. Also, at the same time, we have this tremendous growth in data repositories for research data. I use this slide a lot in teaching and these kinds of presentations, and I used to just cross out the number. 6 months later, you could add 200 or 300, and every time it was just going up, year by year, and it's still really escalating. But right now, if you go there, there's over 2,000 repositories. These are disciplinary repositories, institutional repositories, primarily at Research One universities, where libraries and research computing are investing in making data available, but then also national data service operations. And what I find interesting about RE3 data, it's international, so it's the most comprehensive one we have, but they now are also really trying to advocate for what they call the Science Europe's new framework for discipline-specific research data management. This is an important step, that this discipline-specific approach, but it's not the complete answer. So at the same time, we also have national data services that are emerging. And right now, you will find a national data service in almost every country, except for the US. We are unique in the way we fund science in many ways. We have a very distributed approach in our federal agencies, and we've continued in infrastructure development to sort of keep that distributed model. But yet, the US is very, very active in how these communities are coming together to try to really promote data sharing across both globally and across disciplines. So the Research Data Alliance is a very good example of a very active organization. Their motto is building the social and technical bridges that enable open sharing of data. It too is kind of a hotbed in its growth. I was on the technical advisory board for 3 years, and I think the working groups increased by like 25 within that time. So it continues to grow. I think 5 of those working groups alone were on metadata. And as we'll talk about in a minute, that's very key to sort of what we need to be happening going forward. So what are some of the other driving concerns or motivations? Of course, the notion of reproducibility in science is a big topic. I guess, well, it always has been, right? It's fundamental to the principles of scientific method, but it's become an emergent topic that is often associated with data sharing in a very, very profound way. And a lot of the concern now is really about reproducibility in computational science. There's really been considered to be a kind of crisis in the fact that a lot of the informatics that was happening, when it would come out in publications, you would have results with very little apparatus around it that would supply the evidence behind what was happening in the computational process. So there's a lot of attention now to computational reproducibility. At the same time, there's a lot of organizations and pushes just for the notion of open science, so open source, using open source software in your development, making your own identification accessible through an ID, using open citations that are shareable and easy to grab and promote. So open science is also a big growing area of interest. And along with reproducibility and openness, we often hear about the term and the expectation of transparency. So, and we make some assumptions, I think, about open science being transparent and reproducible science being more transparent. But I did want to bring to your attention the fact that in the social sciences, the idea of transparency is sort of evolving as to something really much more nuanced and specific, in that there's a movement towards trying to, especially in qualitative and mixed methods kinds of studies, to make more explicit sort of the empirical foundation, so the evidence, the data behind claims, but also that logic and process of inquiry. You know, how do you come to your claim? What is, you know, the logic behind what you are actually pulling out of your qualitative data? So, for instance, in the qualitative data repository, which is a project I'm involved in, we've been working on annotation tools that allow qualitative researchers to, along with their publication, to link directly to their data sources and also then annotate sort of their analytical approach or the logic that they're bringing to the claims. And so it's been a little controversial in the social sciences. Qualitative researchers are often hesitant to put this kind of extra effort into their publications, but we're finding a lot of uptake now that they're seeing what they can do and how much they can bring sort of a more robust understanding to the kind of work that they're doing. So the thing I wanted to sort of showcase today, I think, and bring to your attention, though, are the FAIR principles, because this has been really a big advance and an advance. And I'm really glad to see that you guys got the citation and you can read this particular paper that came out in 2016. The task force that started this work originated with Force 11, which is a group of researchers and librarians and people who care about scholarly communication. And then advanced on to now being managed by the Go FAIR group, which is in Europe. But the Nature paper that came out in 2016 in scientific data section was really significant. It was, there were like 50 authors across many different fields, experts in cyberinfrastructure and data sharing. And the thing to really understand about this particular paper that's advocating very strongly this movement is the not that the data necessarily needs to be, well, it does need to be made available for sharing for individuals, but that the hard part and the part we need to be paying attention to in addition is really making sure that the data is also accessible, findable, and interpretable by machines. And so that's why if you go to the FAIR principles and guidelines, you'll see every single statement applies to both data and metadata. Because metadata is the apparatus by which the automated methods will be able to encounter data and be able to really interpret it. So the fundamental 4 parts are data needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we're focusing on the reusable part today. We'll talk a lot about rich metadata, but also about provenance. It's really key aspects of that. Okay, so let's move on to the conceptual part. I'll share with you my thinking around evidential cultures, which I find, again, as I said, so really instructive. This was a paper that came out in Sociology in 1998 by Harry Collins, who's really a quite brilliant sociologist of science. But I think what's so striking to me is how much it speaks to sort of the situation we're in today. The paper is really about the open and closed cultures in gravitational wave research. He does these deep case studies, one of a lab in Italy, which is considered the open example, or the evidential collectivism example, and the other one is in the US, and it's considered the closed culture, or the individualism. And so the idea is that, when, and this is my very crude nutshell for you, people doing gravitational wave research, they point their instruments to the sky, they collect data, and they see interesting things. And so the US lab, thinks of it one way, and the Italian lab thinks of it a very different way. So it boils down to really, what qualifies as a reusable releasable result. So for the Americans, it's really not until I see a wave and I've validated that it is a wave will I release my finding. On the other hand, and this was very controversial, the Italian group says, no, we see our data, we see something interesting. It may just be a coincidence. We have not yet validated that it's actually a wave, but we think this is valuable for the community to have and to interrogate on their own, or to at least assess on their own. So we will release something that is just possibly a coincidence. So for me, I think about this as really, so who's responsible for that validity and meaning behind the data or the result? Is it the lab, like the US says? The lab has to take that responsibility and not publish until, or is it the research community that's out there as the consumer of this data or result? So it gets at this sort of producer-consumer tension that we see a lot. This is a funny microphone. That we see a lot. And then for the purposes today, we'll be talking about a couple of key dimensions that Collins identifies, and that's two things: the ideas of levels of significance and interpretive risk. And so you can think about this in terms of the wave. So the potential coincidence, the interesting thing in the data, lower level of significance, right, and higher level of interpretive risk. So at what point is it, too much risk or insignificant enough not to release? So what I'm hoping you're sitting there thinking about is, what are you producing? Or what are you sharing? Or what are you thinking about sharing? Or what do you hope to be sharing? Is it releasable data, data that you're just willing to let go because you think it's interesting? Reproducible data, that which will function for the same or a similar purpose? Or is it actually reusable data that could be used for a new purpose, maybe in a new field for a new question or problem? And so there, we really, I think, need to start thinking about these issues of significance and interpretive risk. And then I just dropped in this wonderful little figure from a colleague in the UK who does actually biomedical data specialization, that really in this day and age in the digital era, we're thinking about all sorts of rewords. It's not just these three, it's replicate, rerun, regenerate, recycle. There's all sorts of things. But I think these three that I've put up here are the ones that are most important right now, and that are also often conflated. And so people often talk about reproducibility as the ultimate goal, when in fact you can produce reproducible data that may not be reusable. Now the good news is there's been a lot of progress. Some of you might be familiar with the minimum information standards, but they are making progress on reducing that interpretive risk. So the MIBI, the Minimum Information for Biological and Biomedical Investigations, has been explicitly, these are developed by communities of cross-disciplinary specialists for a specific method used in some kind of experimental biology. And the aim is precisely to make sure that data can be verified, analyzed, and interpreted by a wider scientific community. And then, of course, sort of the follow-on from that is that you will be creating more structured data that is really beneficial for databases, for repositories, and for tools for analysis. And so here's just a selected list of some of the minimum information standards that are out there. There are probably 3 or 4 times that many. If you go to fair sharing, they're in there with the 1300 that I showed you earlier. So that's a great advancement, and so this is really people taking seriously this idea of interpretive risk. The issues of significance really aren't talked about very much. In the circles I run in, there were that first decade of sort of promotion of data sharing. We often heard the idea of significance being synonymous with the idea of uniqueness. So the more unique the data is, the more significant it is. So observational data, samples, anything that's from a certain time and place that can't be regenerated is considered significant. And then you go down that, you know, towards the other end where you might have experimental data that might be sort of quasi reproducible, or you can regenerate it again, maybe not under the perfect conditions, but you can do it. And then the idea that computational or derived or computational models, which can be rerun, regenerated, maybe not so significant. Now, I would argue that many of those very, very sophisticated climate models that have taken decades to develop, you're never going to want to regenerate them. And so I think that the significance factor is important, but of course, not the only one. And then since I work a lot in the geo and earth sciences, some of my colleagues at this National Snow and Ice Data Center that I've worked with, I also worked a lot with the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Even though they haven't demonstrated this empirically yet, those people who sit in those repositories understand sort of the patterns of use of their very, popular and important data collections, and they know very, intrinsically that their data has patterns. It becomes very popular when it's first released, then the use goes down, it languishes for a decade, maybe two, but then over time it becomes much more valuable for comparative or longitudinal analysis, and so that the significance of it actually starts going up again. And of course, they feel very vulnerable at that, the trough in terms of resources and being able to keep, again, that curation and that sustainability of those resources when they can't demonstrate that it's being in high demand. Some of the other earth sciences that we've studied, we were also able to start to understand other significance factors. So what makes something valuable for use in these other climate science, ocean modeling, soil science, etc. And so one of the things that emerged, which seems sort of logical but has not been really acted on, or hadn't been, is the idea of the site of collection. Of course, many of these are field sciences, so going out in the field, collecting data regularly or on a pattern or through monitoring. And so here the site factors become very, very critical. So things like unique conditions at the site, sites that are rarely studied, hard to access, maybe in politically volatile areas. There's even areas where the topic of the science is politically volatile. So certain areas where they're doing, sort of deep studies of the environment and things like that, where it can become controversial, especially when it has especially in this era, let's say. And then also places where there's a requirement for permitting. There's only a certain number of people who can collect data, and they have to apply and get the permit to do so. So those are some of the significance factors that we see in earth science. So maybe you're thinking of your own significance factors for your own science. And then in terms of interpretive risk, researchers are really concerned about being able to triangulate, document protocols, workflows, etc., in order to reduce that risk. So what we did after doing those, studying many, many different earth sciences, we took our next study was really a very deep collaboration in geobiology, because that was the most interesting and challenging of all of the sciences we saw, because they were really working hard to integrate data for the systems geobiology questions. So we started working with a group who was very invested in Yellowstone National Park because of the scientific significance of the hot springs there. Over 12,000 thermal features, geologists, microbiologists, geochemists, National Park Service researchers. People come from all over the world. Some come every year. There's rich, rich data being pulled from Yellowstone on everything from the origins of life on Earth to life on other planets because of these extreme conditions, the extremophile environment. And so there's a recognition that all this data, much of it very, very valuable, very deep, has a lot of aggregate value, but yet every year people come, take it back to their labs, and no one has access to it. So we worked with them side by side to sort of develop what we consider a minimum information framework for scientifically significant sites. So through this work, we were really able to start to think more about what these evidential cultures might mean in these different fields. And they really point to and have a alignment with curatorial priorities. So in systems geobiology, the priority is integration. How do we get physical, biological, chemical data that can work together to answer the questions that we have? If we go back and think about volcanology, when we worked with those scientists, their biggest concern was the complex data that they develop and how to keep it together as one object, because they felt it really wasn't meaningful without it. So they collect rocks, they slice the rocks, they digitize the slices, they have deep, extensive field notes, they do chemical analyses, they do a lot of photography, and they felt like all of this had to be captured together. And if anyone was going to, if they're going to share it with anybody, they had to take the whole thing. So very different priorities. So you can't have one method, one approach for either science, for both of them. And then through that, we were also able to see that even though the volcanologists are determined to keep their data all together in these complex objects, in fact, we saw that there was actually interest and really potential high use for the actual chemical analyses. And so, trying to convince volcanologists that they should let go their chemical analysis was not always an easy thing. But we start to see these kinds of dynamics. And then for systems geobiology, we're also able to discern from all of the scientists we were working with that they felt like the biological data was really where the high impact was coming. And so that becomes the most significant, perhaps. So the reuse dependencies that came out of this that we identified for systems geobiology were really, what we did is we sat down these research geologists next to the microbiologists and said, what would it take for you to be able to use each other's data? And so after those kinds of workshops and working sessions, and then going out into the field with many of them and actually examining decades of data that they've collected, we came up with, well, it really has to be the sampling procedures, the field campaign context, location, conditions. But unfortunately, it's hard enough to get people to document things, prepare metadata, but they actually came to the conclusion that that actually required new measurements to be taken in the field, and that was a real challenge. So we did come up with a minimum information framework, and unlike the ones we saw for the biological sciences, the method is not the anchor, it's not the focus, it's rather the site. How do we really optimize for the site, although the method is integrated into that? And so we ended up with a MIF, a minimum information framework that had 3 classes, the field campaign, the structure of the hot spring itself, and the sample site and those measurements. In the past, the emphasis was always on the sample site and those measurements. Often, very little documentation of the structure of the hot spring, yet what we came to learn was that became critical in almost any amount of time, a month. You could go back to the same site, and those hot springs changed so rapidly that you couldn't depend on really understanding the relationship between where the site used to be, for that matter. So the idea is that you have to have these the hot spring vent measurements also in order to calibrate sort of the position and the morphology of the actual sampling point. In addition to that, we learned that all of these scientists, no matter what field they're from, are taking massive numbers of photographs out in the field. They all fancy themselves as wonderful photographers, but they also had a tremendous interest in each other's photography. And some of the geobiologists really claimed that they could not do their analysis without that contextual understanding that came through the photographs, the conditions, and the actual place where the data was collected. The other interesting thing is the altitude. Everyone was doing GPS coordinates, but it didn't tell you the up and down and the altitude, which was critical. And so also ends up that that's very important for research that's going on in coral reefs. another significant scientific kind of site. Okay, so that's just looking at, sort of the complexities of trying to come up with a minimum information framework that really will allow people from other fields to use data over time. Let's think a little bit now about, that larger evolving data ecosystem that's out there. One of the big pushes right now is not just data, but valuing all kinds of research products. And so again, with that computational science, we talked about how the code and the algorithms are very important. Workflows, automatic capture of workflows has become very important. So all these different kinds of products we feel are not only important to share, but for researchers to get credit for. And so in addition to that, we've got lots of journals, of course, requiring that people publish their data as a supplement to the journal publication. How many of you have had to do that or have experienced doing it? Just a couple? Yeah. Get ready. There's going to be a lot more of that. And so that's a step forward. And in fact, repositories like Dryad, which started in the environmental sciences, was made particularly to accommodate that demand that was coming from new journals making this new requirement. It gave environmental scientists somewhere to put those data. And now is actually, again, evolved into a much larger scope and takes data from many other sciences. The other phenomena that we may not see so much in the biological sciences, but it's really taken hold in earth science, and we're seeing it now in the humanities as well, are something called data journals. And these are journals devoted exclusively to papers just about the data. So it really is a paper that describes in great depth the value, the significance, the methods, what that data is all about and why it's important. And so again, giving researchers the opportunity to get credit for a very valuable data that they're collecting. What I see it as just like the immense, the deepest metadata you could ever get for a data set. So they serve a lot of, interesting purposes. And then of course we have the thousands of repositories that we talked about earlier. And these are disciplinary, institutional repositories, Research One universities. Most of them have some place where you can put your data if you don't have another option, or if it's also important for institutions to be collecting and promoting the areas of expertise and the deep, data resources that they're generating. So the institutional repositories have sort of a different goal and motive, but also very important. And then these national initiatives, which we're seeing across the world. But with thousands of data repositories and data journals and supplementary places, we're also seeing something that's really sort of hindering what we're trying not to do, and that's silos of data. In fact, earth sciences, we don't see it yet in the publications, but if you go to the meetings, there's a lot of chatter now about the problems with the requirements for supplementary data. Because in fact, all it's doing is pushing those individual data sets out into places where they can't be found, they can't be aggregated, they can't be put together in meaningful, deep ways. So we're sort of building some concerns into our new systems. There's the ongoing problem of dark data. We all know of these researchers, brilliant researchers who have these data sets they collect over their entire careers. They retire and it disappears. But then just those researchers who leave Yellowstone every year and it's back in their lab's hard drive and no one else has access to it. So continually generating dark data. And then this constant tension of if you are going to manage it, or if you are going to make it available, how do you make sure you optimize it so people are willing to let go of it as producers, but yet also be available in a way that someone else can apply it to a new problem. I won't spend too much time on this, but I did want to draw your attention to also this idea of curation life cycles and research life cycles. It's surprisingly maybe, there's dozens of these that have been published in the last few years. It's escalating sort of like everything else. But they are important because they force the issue of looking at data as something that lasts and changes over time. The problem is they're distinct from each other. We have curation life cycles that very archival perspective to them, aren't really optimized yet for data-driven science or big data. So we're kind of got a project now working on that. But they also need to be integrated with some of these, the research life cycle. So how do we really understand all of it together, not you do your research and then it's curated, because it really all feeds back into the same kind of loop. So let's go back to FAIR principles. This is, like I said, a great advancement, getting a lot of attention. And if we go back to thinking about findable, accessible, interoperable, many of those things have to do with metadata and standards. But reusable, I'd like to think we could expand that to be reusable more than just for the same purpose, or what people usually conflate as reproducible, to reusable across sciences. But that will require domain relevant standards that actually are taken a step further, where you really think through what it means for application elsewhere. And then also the idea of provenance is critical. And I've been studying interdisciplinary research processes almost my whole career as an information scientist. And when we moved towards sort of the data operations, around 2000, but really fundamentally there's a similar sort of fundamental need. And that it's not just about being able to get that data from across the boundary from some other discipline. It's really about sustaining with that the path back to those disciplinary foundations. And that's why those, the MIBI frameworks are important, because it takes you back to those, methodological principles. But there's other principles, theoretical and others, that we need to make sure are also brought forward. And in the digital age, this is very complex, of course, because data can travel anywhere. It can be, broken apart, pushed out in different ways, subsetted. The work I did with the National NCAR, National Atmospheric Research Center, they spend, probably 50% of their curation time subsetting data for certain purposes, for certain climate models. And so as soon as something's subsetted, you have a provenance problem, and you have to be able to track that. So, data sharing, hard work, costly, and a time sink. All those things, right? Things that you as researchers don't have time for, but yet the expectation is there and it's growing. So how do you do this? Well, follow your community lead often, but there's a lot of help on campuses, especially Research One universities. And so for instance here at UW, we have research data services in the university library, as do many research libraries. Health Sciences has a great set of resources available to you. One of the biggest problems people have is, where should it go? I produce this kind of data, what's the right place for it? And they can help counsel you on that. They're also very, very proficient at data management planning and giving you examples and samples and things you can, models you can use to make sure those are up to compliance. And then things like the data, the Hutch Data Commonwealth is a new initiative there, where they're really taking the curatorial side more seriously in order to build ecosystems of data for their own purposes. So I want to circle back just for a minute though, and think about this idea of understanding evidential cultures and taking it back to this idea of the public, because it's pretty daunting, even just thinking about how we share it across different disciplines, even different sciences, let alone the social sciences and the physical sciences integration, for instance. But now there's also a very, very big push to making all sorts of data available to the public. So I know you can't see it here, but if you go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the big climate model activities, there's a statement there that says, here's our data, it's available to the government, to non-governmental agencies, and to the public. So think about interpretive risk when the public starts accessing data and trying to make sense of it. National Snow and Ice Data Center has long had a section of data for everyone. It's used extensively by journalists, so most of the images you see of sea ice and the graphics you see around the Arctic and that come from there, but they do try to promote their data use for anyone. So we have, I'm leading a project at the Information School that's trying to help with this. It's called Open Data Literacy. We're trying to help educate and develop the technical expertise of information professionals that go into government, public sector, and public libraries to help the public understand what data is out there, to bring data together that's important to them, and figure out how to apply it. And then, of course, in the health and medical arena, all sorts of initiatives around trying to get more data from the public, and then find ways to help the public benefit from that. And so, again, I think these ideas of what's significant, what moves our science forward, but where do we weigh in that interpretive risk, and how do we work with the data to make to alleviate that as much as we can, very important. So I know we want to leave time for questions, but I always like to point people to some fun, comical things. I highly recommend watching this video. It's hilarious. It's NYU's Health Sciences Library put together a series of animations on data sharing. So as you proceed in your careers and you're mentoring others and trying to help them understand the importance and value, this is sometimes a nice, easy road into that. And then if you're not familiar with the Overly Honest Methods Twitter feed, has anyone seen it? Yeah, do you contribute to it? No, there's it's not all about data, but a lot of it is. And so some fun things there, and things that hit a little too close to home sometimes. So acknowledgements to my collaborators and students who have helped in some of the projects that I drew from today. And thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions. And don't forget, you can use your phone, right?
Yeah.
To ask your question?
Yes.
Did you get any?
Yes,
Oh.
we got some questions. So remember everyone, Slido, slido.com, and it's BRI 05 if you want to ask a question.
But you can raise your hand too.
Yes, so we do have some questions online, but if anybody wants to just kind of, in this huge room, ask a question in person to Carole, go for it. Otherwise, I'll read one of them off on Slido. Okay, all right, I'm going to read one of the Slido. It says, good scientists develop a very strong personal investment in their work and data. What is the impetus for scientists to share? It feels like giving your newborn away. So.
Well, now it's become mandated by your funding agencies, but that wasn't always the case. And again, there's not a lot of enforcement there. So I'll take it back to, I think I messed up on one of these slides because, yeah, this one. We hear a lot of this with qualitative data, and so this may not be a qualitative researcher, but they have all sorts of reasons not to want to share. And also in the earth sciences, we see a lot of worries about getting scooped and that sort of thing as well. And so some of these specialized data services are really good at helping you think through why and how you might actually feel comfortable doing it. So I agree. I mean, we're all truly invested. These are our raw materials of our intellectual life, right? It's a very hard thing to let go of. But yet, I think as you start to see sort of the power of data-driven inquiry and sort of the rationale behind why the government even wants this to happen is, solving those scientific problems. So I will point you though to, and I'm sorry I skipped over this, but if you do qualitative work, I mean, there are places like the QDR that will help you think through the risk disclosure for how to de-identify your data, how to subset your data, how you might take some segment of that you really can't let go of, but somehow represent it in a way, at least you get credit for it. You can, sort of register it, make it yours, put your stake in the ground. That can be really important. That's another reason to let go of it. And to get recognized. When I worked with all those earth scientists, he'd sit in a room and they'd talk about, so-and-so, he's just got the most incredible data. I mean, he'll get reputations for being the person with the most exclusive, important data. So I think there's, personal, career-driven reasons to do it, but part of it is altruistic, and that's sometimes a hard sell. The other thing about QDR is you have lots of options about who can actually get to it. You can put restrictions on that says a secondary user has to have an IRB approval from their own institution before they can use my data. You can put that restriction on it. Or you can say, I need to approve that person. I need to talk to them. You can say, they have to come here and look at it. I'm not letting it go online. Or I can say, this part you can see in 2 years, this part you can see now. So lots of options of ways you can make it, sort of customize it, so something that works for you.
Okay, great. Another question that was sort of upvoted, and then there was a related question. In the context of biomedical data, what constraints does the desire for privacy and security of data sources place on decisions involved in data sharing? And someone else asked about sort of privacy of research participants. I mean, so many of us in the room are doing work with human subjects, and so how do we think about some of these privacy and security concerns as we're trying to make our data accessible and reusable?
Yeah, so I guess this slide's helpful there as well, because one of the things that QDR does will help you work, first of all, with your informed consent scripts to make sure that the informed consent you're getting will work in a data sharing environment. And they spend a lot of time, a lot of researchers are having to backtrack and try to work through that after the fact. So there's, the sensitive data, and a lot of the work we're doing now with the Sloan Foundation really is about sensitive data in the digital environment, because you can have data that's locked down, very restricted in QDR, for instance, but as soon as it's shared, how do you make sure those restrictions travel with it? And so these are actually really important research questions that are under consideration, but there's a lot of now attention to enclaves. So data enclaves that are more of this lockdown, you have to come to the location, it can't be let loose on the web. There's even census data that is in enclaves. So that's one solution, but it's not a very robust one, and it's not really in the spirit of what a lot of even NIH is wanting to see. So I think it's really a matter of teasing out what it is you can share or how you can represent it. There's lots of de-identification techniques that you can be counseled on, that can help you, and you can actually sort of outsource some of that work with people who that's what they do. But no, it's critical. And again, I'm not biomedical is not my deep expertise, but we are working very hard with qualitative researchers in particular.
All right, great, thank you. So there have been a couple of questions that are on a similar kind of issue. One person asked, minimal information is important, but each question has its own design. How can you get around this problem? There's another question in here that I saw. Oh, do standards inadvertently, and it was a parenthetical, inadvertently interfere with the observation of diverse phenomena? So this kind of these issues about sort of minimal information and design specificity and heterogeneity, I guess, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I really like that question. So, because I'm the small data person, I'm the one that says all data is unique, it all has its context, how could you ever, make it all. So homogeneous data is much easier, right? It doesn't matter how big it is, if it's homogeneous, you can move it, you can migrate it, you can do a single performance, a single operation on it, and it all changes and it's all the same. So it is true, so this design issue, I think the social sciences have handled this the best, because in what they often do is for a fully curated data set would include documentation on all of your design, your instruments, your rationale, all of that would be included as documentation. And so with the expectation that if anyone was going to reuse it, they would have to be aware of all that. But that the notion of, that uniqueness and that everything, and I was the skeptic. I was like, there's no such thing as minimum information. that works, right? But it's this trade-off, it's this balance of what's practical, what can you really do? Because you saw how intense it was even just to get, you know, those 3 classes that would work for that many different sciences, and that was pretty minimal, but it's still a lot of new and extra work. So it really is that balancing, and that's why I sort of hesitated when I pointed to the MIFs, because I don't think they're really quite doing what they say they are. They're making a lot of progress on standardizing, but I don't think they've made it to the point where they're capturing enough context to really get at the heart of what makes, you know, the deep knowledge that goes into the research. So it's all about the documentation and how much of that you share. And that's why it is important that the papers are also linked to the data. And so you don't want to, you know, destroy that chain of explanation.
Thank you. And maybe one, I think this is the last question. So if anybody has a burning question out there, now's your chance. You got to type it in or raise your hand. Anybody want to? Oh, great. All right, please ask loudly, and then I will repeat for our recording here. Yeah.
What do you think the ethical responsibility of those managing the data repository are for ensuring that their infrastructure is capable of handling the data that they need?
Okay, so the question was, what are the ethical responsibilities of repository managers for ensuring that the infrastructure is sufficient to handle the data that are being made available? Did I get that right? Okay.
Well, I love that question too. Mostly because I feel like we have a lot of accidental repository managers, just like we have a lot of accidental all sorts of technical people, right? They're just talented and they end up doing things. I think they take it very seriously, but I will say as an information school, we educate people to go into these kinds of roles, and we integrate, you know, the ethics part from day one into, you know, what it means and why we do it, and ethical data science, responsible data science is all part of our curriculum. And it's spreading. I mean, I think it's really happening all over, but it's sort of a new field, and I think we're growing into the ethics side. Now, I think you can rest assured the very long-standing data repositories like National Snow and Ice Data Center, the ICPSR, and the social sciences, they are very professionalized and take this very seriously, and they're the exemplars of that. But I think, you know, the institutional repositories, the ones that are just linked up to journal publications, it's not as prominent to them, and it really needs to be. But something like QDR, I mean, that's what they're all about, is how do we help you with very sensitive private data meet the compliance expectations, but also how do you get the credit and the recognition for the really rich, valuable data that you're producing? Great question, thank you.
Great. I think we're probably going to have to draw it to a close there. Thank you all so much for being here, for your attention. Thank you, Carole, for your presentation. Please join me in thanking Carole Hall.